video, we're looking into a scenario in which Ethiopia forms an empire in 2024. And the first thing they do is just straight up annex Djibouti. Because they felt like just annexing it. They just felt like annexing it. And now they have a coastline, so they build the strongest navy in the world. Even stronger than the Royal Navy. Why am I speaking like part of the Royal Navy at this point? I don't know anymore. And so, they move in. And well, they move in. And they move deeper in. And they touch the coast. But they get pushed back by one of the rebel groups in Somalia. Because why not? If you're a rebel, you might as well push the main group back. And well, Somalia attempts to kick Ethiopia out of their country. But Somaliland rebels are struggling. Probably not easy to fight a war as like 17 different rebel groups. But still possible, I mean. And well, an Ethiopian ship gets stolen. Okay, that's not good. But Somalia is forced into capitulation because they can't even fight anymore. Kind of sad. They once almost beat Ethiopia, or they thought they would, in a civil war, and they didn't do well. Well, yeah, that's kind of embarrassing, honestly. Not as embarrassing as Egypt's defeat, Italy's defeat in Greece. Like, that's just embarrassing. Imagine getting kicked back by half the amount of troops you sent in. Like, that's just worse than embarrassing. Well, they annex Eritrea and they declare the Great Horn of African Empire. So they decide to go into Kenya. First, they build up troops on the country. Then they strike ports, military bases, and anything of strategic importance as they build a naval blockade. And they now send in their forces. Well, as air and naval supremacy has been created, it goes pretty good at first. As Ethiopian troops move in all over the place. Well, as more and more Ethiopian troops arrive, the front line gets built pretty well. As they stabilize their front at this point. As Kenya attempts a major counter-offensive, but only makes tiny movements. And its country is completely embarrassed, but due to Ethiopian air and naval supremacy, Ethiopia manages to take over the coastline. And at this point, Kenya is forced into capitulation. Ethiopia decides to do this. They decide to take a big chunk of the country away. And by big chunk, I mean big chunk. So let's see how the border goes. So they decide to annex these parts of the country while creating a puppet, which is really weak and has no way of defending itself. But Ethiopia has no plans of invading into Tanzania at this point. Why? Because, well, what's the point? But Tanzania decides to meet with Egypt, Sudan, and Uganda over a treaty organization, which they secretly sign. It's called the Group of Four. But they're quiet about this existence. Their existence isn't known. As Ethiopia decides to move into South Sudan. South Sudan is running into problems pretty quickly, as they didn't expect this much strength to come from the Ethiopian army. That the Ethiopian army using a very similar strategy to what they used in Kenya, quickly capturing the country. So let's see the peace treaty. Well, the peace treaty looks like this. They annex a massive chunk of South Sudan, and they puppet a massive piece of Sudan. Why would they puppet these areas? Well, puppeting is useful to them, and they can make more of it. With the Ugandan invasion breaking out. Well, after a few days, As Ethiopia starts advancing in, realizing nobody's going to intervene, they believe, they start moving more and more troops off the rest of their borders. But this was a plan by the group of four. In the north, they start moving in, whereas Tanzania focuses on holding back Uganda and holding its front. With them not invading South Sudan yet, they don't want to bring the puppet in because it's not in yet, so it's worthwhile not to bring it in. With them trying to get to the Grand Renaissance Dam to get rid of it, but they kind of fail. While the front against Uganda moves south. With them bringing in the Kenyan puppet with like 10,000 troops is all they have. With them managing to seize the coast of them before they could launch a counteroffensive, so they decide to surrender. With Egyptian and Sudanese troops starting to move deeper into the country. Ethiopia comes with a strategy to push them back. So I'm making an encirclement, but unfortunately they get pushed back somewhere else on the front. With them realizing Sudan and Egypt are a big threat to their existence, they start sending more and more troops. As Egypt and Sudan are unwilling to surrender. Surrender is weakness, according to them. But as their counteroffensives in the occupied lands become worse, as people in these groups revolt, wanting Ethiopian control, Ethiopia decides to bring Sudan into the war now that they pushed South Sudan in, as they push Sudan back. That's Sudan and Egypt pushing them back, but their counteroffensives of Egypt and Sudan are getting weaker and weaker. With Ethiopia deciding to spearhead straight to Khartoum, and they manage to even take the city pretty quick. And Sudan is unable to push them back there, so Sudan is forced into surrender, and Egypt decides, yeah, I don't feel like losing lands, I'm out. And they leave the war before anybody can stop them. So let's see the peace treaty. Land, like maybe a third, less than a third maybe. Just under a third, and they took a tiny chunk from Tanzania and Uganda, and they made a Uganda puppet, adding on to their Kenya and South Sudan puppets. But without their puppets, they're still pretty mighty of an empire. They're still pretty big. That's it without any puppets. And as you can see, it's massive. Massive. Now that's an empire. That's all for today's video. Please like, subscribe, and comment. Wild Mapper out, but not until you subscribe.